o'clock, a little after 7 o'clock, and we just ask questions and we look for answers. We want to find biblical answers to questions that we have so that we can know what it is that God wants us to do. And there's no question that's off limits. It can be anything about religion, spiritual things, philosophy, anything, just searching for truth. That's what we want to do. And we look forward to anybody who has any questions. So what we'll do is we'll start with one of the questions that one of the children asked earlier today, and it was actually Jaden. You guys remember what Jaden's question was? It was a good question.
I think so.
What was it?
Didn't he ask how can we know what the Bible says is true?
Yes, that's exactly what he asked. How can we know? How can we know whether or not it wasn't the Bible? How can we know whether or not we should believe in Jesus? Right? That's a really good question. And so I thought what we would do tonight is I would ask you guys some reasons why you do. And if you don't have any, then maybe we'll see if we can come up with some. And we're not gonna address it thoroughly, right? This won't be a thorough addressing of that topic, just because that's not we don't have time for it. But we'll answer some things, and if other people have comments, we'll throw those out there. If people have questions, feel free to ask those too. So why do you believe that Jesus is real? First of all, let's just start with real. Why do you think that Jesus is a real person?
Aren't there historical records that talk about a carpenter from Nazareth who was crucified, claiming to be the king of the Jews?
Yeah, so they don't like get that specific. They don't say his name is Jesus. His mom was Mary. He had brothers and sisters. These are their names, right? They don't do that. But they do. There are some historical writers. And what you're dealing with when you get into those historical writers is nobody cares about carpenters from Galilee. Right? Nobody cares about much of anything from Galilee in the first century, especially if you're Roman. So first of all, when you start going back and looking at historical sources, you shouldn't expect to find a bunch of them. And if you find a bunch of them, you should be really suspicious. Right? And so like later on, there will be things people fabricate evidence. And so you have to be careful because unfortunately, people don't always tell the truth when they try and defend what they believe. Right? Some people put what they believe above what is true, and we just don't want to do that. So there aren't a whole bunch of sources from the time when Jesus was alive, because honestly, nobody cares about a carpenter from Galilee. The fact that he gets mentioned at all by Roman historians is significant. Right? So some of the mentions that you'll get is there is a Roman historian named Tacitus, and he will mention a person called Chrestus, which is, you're a Roman, right? He doesn't speak Greek. Christ is a Greek word, and Christos is Greek, but there's also a Greek word Christos, which means good. And there are Christians in the first century who refer to Jesus as Jesus the Good, not just Jesus the Christ. Right? So the fact that you have a Roman writer referring to this Christos, this good one, and he has followers, is very interesting. Because the fact that you have a Galilean carpenter mentioned at all by a Roman historian is relatively significant. And this would be roughly, he's writing about events that happened roughly 30 years after the crucifixion, right? We're writing about the burning of Rome, which is in the 60s, and Jesus died in the 30s. So it's roughly 30 years after Jesus' death. There's a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus who writes about Jesus. So there are some historians in the first century, right? Both of those people, Tacitus, Josephus, they're writing in and about the first century. So there are some localized historical writers who write about Jesus. You also have in front of you some historical documents that talk about Jesus. And what people want to do is they want to say, oh, well, you can't count the Bible. That's a religious book. I mean, yeah, it is a religious text, but it's also an historical text. And the fact that you have it at all is evidence that there was a Christ. People who wrote this claimed to have seen Jesus, They wrote it to people who would have known whether or not there was a Jesus. So when Matthew sits down and Matthew writes his gospel and he talks about all these things that happened in Jerusalem, well, if you lived in Jerusalem, I mean, don't you think it would be really easy to say, well, that never happened? Who's this Jesus guy you're talking about? Nobody knows who that is, right? It would have been really easy to disprove the stories. In fact, the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, which is a very, very well documented historical writing, very, very reliable historical document. In the book of Acts, Paul will actually stand up and Paul will say, talking about the events, of Jesus's life, he will say, these things weren't done in a corner. You know what I'm talking about. Now, could he say that if that wasn't true?
No, because somebody would call him out on that. Be like, that never happened.
Yeah, he's on trial when he says that. So he has some adversaries there that would really like to see him fail. And so if he stands up and says, these things weren't done in a corner, everybody knows what I'm talking about, then all they have to do is say, we have no idea what you're talking about. It's totally ridiculous. You're making things up. Right? So the fact that that never happens is very significant. It would be very easy in the first century to disprove Christianity. If people are running around talking about this Jesus who didn't exist ever, that's kind of easy to prove. Right? If he was supposedly crucified by a Roman governor, and the Romans keep pretty good records, right? It would be very easy to go and say, well, I mean, that never happened. Right? If you have these guards who go through these things, supposedly we have the name of the Roman guard, centurion or guard who stabs him. It'd be very easy to go and disprove these things, right? And nobody ever does. So there is some historical reasons to at least believe, that Jesus was a real person, right? You might not agree that he was the Messiah, but people who argue, oh, well, he wasn't even real, that's not honestly dealing with the evidence that we have. Right? I mean, there's just as much evidence that Jesus was real as nearly every ancient person. There's more evidence that Jesus was a real person than Homer was a real person. Or you could even argue Socrates, right? I mean, why isn't the Socrates story a myth? Aristotle just dreamed him up. Aristotle and Plato, they needed to have somebody to blame for their ideas. So they dreamed up this Socrates fellow. I mean, how come we don't hear people making arguments like that?
Well, because people know that Socrates was a real person.
Right. It doesn't deal well with the historical evidence that we have. And so when you start talking about Jesus, it's the same thing. Now, yes, you don't have a plethora of Romans writing about Jesus because Romans don't care about Jesus in the first century. They just don't. I mean, there's a very, very small portion of the city of Rome that will come to know who Jesus is and care about him on any significant level in the beginning of the first century. At the end of the first century, the Romans generally don't like Jesus. In fact, that writer that I was telling you about, who's writing about Chrestus, he actually calls the religion vile. Right? He talks about how all the vile things come to Rome, and that was his view of Christianity. Not this wonderful religion with this nice guy who leads his followers and they're so peaceful, and he's like they're terrible, they're awful people, right? And so it's not like they're being friendly to the Romans. They don't, or to the Christians. The Romans don't like Christianity. The Greeks generally don't like Christianity. It takes a long time for things to take root and grow and become what they will eventually become. It's just generally not really accepted at first. Okay, so what else? What other evidence?
Well, if he was a real person, wouldn't they have tried to disprove what he was saying?
Yeah, so then you get to the teachings, right? The things that Jesus says.
Excuse me.
And there are some books that you can buy that actually do that. Like they go through the biblical text and they look at the things that Jesus says and they use those as an argument for his existence. And so we do have that. When you get to the text, you can compare what Jesus says to what is written in other places. Like Jesus will talk about Moses testifying about him. So does the Old Testament match up with who Jesus is and what Jesus does and stuff like that, right? Does does he actually fulfill the prophecies that would have been about the Messiah? Is he born in the right place? Does he come from the right lineage? Does he do the things that the Messiah was supposed to do? And these are all questions that people are actually asking in the first century when Jesus shows up. In fact, people will note that he comes from Galilee. And they will say, go check the scriptures and see that the Messiah doesn't come from Galilee. Well, Jesus didn't come from Galilee. I mean, like, he lived there, but he was born in Jerusalem, or sorry, Bethlehem, right? Jerusalem's the wrong place. He's born in Bethlehem, which is what Micah says. Micah says that the ruler will come from Bethlehem in Ephrathah, and that's where Jesus is born. That's where David is from. And so Jesus fulfills that. There are other prophecies in the scripture, like the prophet will say, out of Egypt I've called my son. And Jesus's family flees to Egypt, and then they come back from Egypt later, right? And so there's multiple things like that where you ask the question, what did the Old Testament predict? And does Jesus fulfill what the Old Testament says about the Messiah? And now that there's argument there will be people, obviously, lots of Jewish people, who say no, he doesn't. He doesn't fulfill those things. But at that point, you have to admit, first of all, that he's real. Second, that he claimed to be the Messiah. And then we can argue about whether or not he fulfilled the prophecies that the Messiah was supposed to fulfill. Right? So you have to admit a lot before you even get to that point. So if people want to argue with you about whether or not Jesus has fulfilled the prophecies in the Old Testament, you've actually already covered a lot of ground. He's a real person, and he claimed to be the Messiah. So now the question is he actually the Messiah or not? Does he fit the bill? And that's where you would go through and examine the Old Testament. So you would say that the evidence that you have are the prophecies that were given 700 years or earlier before Jesus is even born. And so it's not like Jesus is born, and when he's 35, people start prophesying about what's going to happen, right? These prophecies are hundreds upon hundreds of years old before Jesus even shows up, and there's some that are even older than that, right? Moses would prophesy about the one who is coming, and he would prophesy in about 1450 BC.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's nearly 1,500 years before the Messiah comes, right? Abraham will say some things. Some things will be said to Abraham, and that's like around 1800 BC. So you're getting close to 2,000 years, right? You're pushing the limit on 2,000 years before Jesus comes, where you have these things that are starting to be said about the Messiah. I don't know when. It's written in 1450 or so BC, but I don't know when Adam and Eve get that prophecy. And if you just want to pick a number, we'll just say 2600 BC, just to pick a number. Well, now that's a long time, right? It would be even further back than that. I'm just picking a number. So 2,500 years, and that's a really, really, really conservative estimate. So then you go through and you look and you say, does he fill the prophecies? Does he fit the bill? And that's why Matthew says, this happened to fulfill what was written in Isaiah the prophet. This happened to fulfill what was written and then he quotes the prophecy to you, right? Jesus himself will stand up in Luke chapter 4, and he will quote from the prophets in the synagogue, and he will say, what does he say?
This happened to fulfill the prophecy of whichever prophecy he's talking about.
Yeah.
And doesn't he say in one case, this prophecy has been fulfilled in your hearing today?
Uh-huh. That's Luke chapter 4. Yeah. So we can turn over there and we can read. If you're watching along with us, we had this screen. We were going to put the Bible verses up there, but it didn't look right yet. So we're going to fix that, and we'll have it up there next week. We've got a new setup going on, and so we're trying to get everything worked out.
What verse in chapter 4?
I'm turning over there right now. It's where he goes to the synagogue. So it starts in about verse 16, and he quotes from Isaiah, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So that's what he says. And then he says, this has happened in your presence, right? First, he rolls up his sleeves and sits down. Or rolls up the scroll and sits down. And then, this has happened in your hearing. So he quotes from Isaiah 61. right? So the people who are writing these gospel accounts and Jesus himself will refer back continually. In fact, over in John, when he's talking with the Pharisees, he will say, you say that you believe in Moses, but Moses is the one who testifies about me. And so they're continually referring back. So what else could you do if you needed some evidence so that you could believe? What else would you look for?
This is very similar to what we just were talking about, but the things Jesus says, if the people who, like his opponents, the people who didn't like him, who were trying to say that he wasn't the Messiah, if he wasn't, it would have been ideal, I guess, for their cause to point out any mistakes he's making, rules he's breaking, teachings that he's saying that go against what they already know.
Yeah, I agree with you. You would want to find mistakes that he makes, things that he does wrong, so that you could then point those things out and say, look, he's not who he's claiming to be. Right? Because the thing about Jesus is not only does he claim, and this is where things kind of get interesting, is he doesn't claim to be a rabbi. Right? If he was just Jesus the rabbi, yeah, big deal, right? He comes, he has some good teaching, but he's just giving you his thoughts on the law of Moses. He does that. But if he was only a rabbi, then it's not a big deal. He's just a teacher. Right? We know lots of rabbis. And you can agree with them, you can disagree, it doesn't really matter. They're just rabbis. But when Jesus comes, Jesus claims to be more than a rabbi. And so he claims to be the Son of God. And there are multiple times in the gospel accounts where the people who hear him pick up stones and they want to kill him. And he's like, what are you doing? and they say, well, you're claiming to be
God.
Yeah, to be God. You make yourself equal with God. They knew what he was saying. And he's like, yeah, you're right. But I can prove it.
Yeah, no one ever disproves that, which is interesting.
Yes. So, but this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a man who doesn't claim to be a teacher. He doesn't claim to be a philosopher. He is. He claims to be the Son of God, divine, equal with God himself, which means that he would have to exhibit the very nature and the characteristics of God himself. So if you can find Jesus lying, if you can find Jesus doing something that God wouldn't do, then, or if you can catch him making a mistake, like you said, like if he says one thing and then later he says something else and there's no way to reconcile it. That's the thing, is we say different things all the time, right? Like when I'm talking to Zane and Zane needs to sit down, I'll say, sit down. But then if you need to stand up, I'll tell you, stand up. Well, can you come along later and say, pick? Well, no, I was talking to different people and they needed to hear different things. So when you look at the biblical text, you have to ask the question, first of all, can this be reconciled? And if there is no reconciliation, then what does this actually prove? But when it comes to Jesus, if Jesus says one thing and then says something else that cannot be reconciled, then that means he's wrong about something. And the God that the Bible attempts to describe can never be wrong. So if you can show that Jesus was wrong about something, then he isn't who he claims to be.
That would show he's not divine.
Right. Then he would just be a rabbi or
a crazy
teacher.
Rabbi.
Right. But that's the thing, right? He claims to be the Son of God. And today, when people run around claiming to be the Son of God, well, we go, they're crazy.
Yeah.
There's something not right with them. Right? You used to get locked up for that. People claimed to be Napoleon. They claimed to be all sorts of, historical figures. People claiming to be the divine Son of God. Well, they would get locked up too. You're crazy. Right? And so that's the people accuse Jesus of that. They would say, you have a demon, which is how we say you're crazy. Right? We don't say you have a demon. We just say you're a lunatic. But in the Old Testament times, in the ancient world, they would say you have a demon. And they were very familiar in the text, at least superstitiously so. But in the text, we see demon possession and people dealing with that. So it was a real thing. And when a demon possessed people, you remember the man over in the country of the Gadarenes, how did he behave?
He was crazy.
It was insane. They had him tied with chains in the graves, where they tried to bind him with chains, but he just broke him every time.
Yeah, and he ran around
without any clothes on.
No, the word is naked. Naked. Okay. Yeah. He was naked because that's what people who are possessed by demons tend to do. They don't act normal, right? So if Jesus has a demon, then he would be like that man from the Gerasenes or the Gadarenes,
And
same
he
thing, right?
doesn't act like that.
Right.
Another interesting thing is that he actually casts out the demons.
Yes. And that will be another thing that people will say is you cast out demons by the power of Beelzebul, right? By the power of Satan. And then Jesus famously says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. If I'm casting out demons by the power of Satan, then who do your sons cast them out by? And he'll say, but if I cast them out by the power of God, then the kingdom of God has truly come upon you. And so, but again, he's doing the same thing. He's saying you have to deal with what I'm doing, and you have to deal with what I'm saying. You can't just pass it off. Either I am insane and I have a demon, or I am who I claim to be. And there's no other option.
But if he was insane, they would have been able to catch him in something.
Right.
Because they're always posing riddles or asking him weird questions.
Right. There's no way that he could deal with the complicated questions that they ask him if he was insane on the level that they were, if he's demon possessed, right?
He probably couldn't even have answered them correctly if he was just a normal person from Galilee.
Right. Well, they're asking questions that they don't have the answers to, right? Or they can't think of an answer that won't get him in trouble. And these people who are posing the questions, they're very, very intelligent people. The scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were not simpletons. They are the brightest and the best among the Jewish people. And so when they come to him with a question that they can't perceive an answer to, we cheat because we have the text, right? And so we see the answer already, and then we think, oh, well, that was simple. But it's not a simple question until you see the answer. It's kind of like chess puzzles. You know how when you're doing the chess puzzles and you've got this setup or this layout on the board, and you're like, I have no idea what to do. And so then you click the hint button and it shows you just move your queen here. And then you're like, oh, well, that's simple. But it wasn't until someone showed you the answer. All right. So it's the same thing. They come to Jesus and they ask him, tell us, teacher, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not? So that's a yes or no question. If you say yes, then they can say, you're not a faithful Jew. You're saying that we should pay the Roman government, this oppressive government who is suppressing us and who's not allowing us to exercise our religion freely, who's doing all these things. You side with them. If he says no, then they can say, oh, well, you're an insurrectionist. You're suggesting that we rebel against Rome. You're telling people not to pay taxes, the tribute that Caesar rightly demands from his subjects. And so they've got it. You can't answer that question. Right. And you can see why when they come to him, they're like, well, there's no way he's going to answer this. And then what does he do?
Yeah, he answers it.
But what does he do?
He kind of says yes.
He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's.
Yes, but how does he do that? What's the first thing he says?
He asks them for a denarius.
Yes. Give me a denarius. Where did they get it?
From their pocket.
From their pocket, right? Because their argument is going to be that they could argue that Jesus is using unclean money, right? Because it has an image of Caesar on it. But then he gets the money from their pocket.
So the argument would be like almost accusing him of idolatry, basically.
Right. That would be one possible thing. And so he just cuts that off and he says, let me see some of your money.
Let me see your idol.
Right. And they hand it to him and he's like, look, whose picture is that? And so it's actually kind of embarrassing for the Pharisees to have to go, well, that's Caesar's, right? Because he says, whose image is that, right? Whose idol is that? Whose idol is that? And it came out of their pocket. They're walking around with the little, carved images, right? That they would have said, oh, you can't have that. Here, there it is. It's in your pocket.
So would they say you couldn't have it because Caesar claimed to be a god?
No, just because anything that was even associated with Rome, they tried to find reasons why it was bad. At this time, that's really a separate question.
Sorry, I don't understand why the money was evil though.
You couldn't use it in the temple, and it had the image of a man who claimed to be a king, and there is no God, there is no king but God.
But
unless we want a king.
Wasn't he in the temple when he was teaching this?
I think he is in the temple complex. Yeah.
So is that why it would have been weird that they had
Let's
it?
look. Let's look. I'm gonna say I think, and then we're gonna get in trouble.
Yeah. That would make it look even worse if they had it in the temple. And
Let's
these
see.
microphones are hard to get used to.
Yeah, you have to put your face right up to it, or it's not gonna hear you. All right. Let's see. So while we're looking that up, basically what he says then is render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. So he starts it off with whose image is that? Well, that's Caesar's,
Mm.
right? But whose image are you supposed to be?
God's.
God's
You're
image.
supposed to be God's, right? So you are supposed to be made in the image of God, image bearers for God. And the Hebrew people, especially as the chosen nation, are supposed to be a nation of images for the Lord. So in Matthew chapter 22, verse 19 is where he asks the question, show me the coin for the tax. And so they get it out of their pot. They bring to him a denarius. Then Jesus says to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? Right? Whose icon is literally the word. The ESV says likeness, but it's the word for idol or image. Whose image is this? Caesar's. Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. Well, if this is Caesar's image, then just give Caesar what belongs to him. But you are supposed to be God's image. Give yourself to God.
Yeah, it'd be weird for something to have someone's picture stamped on it if it doesn't belong to them. So if you're in the image of God, you belong to God.
Yeah.
Dad,
What?
the text puts this a little ambiguously, but did they just like pull it out of their pocket, or did they have to go like get the coin?
They bring it to him, and it doesn't tell us where they get it. It just says they bring it to him.
But
And
the
so,
fact is they had it with them,
yeah,
which is the force of the argument.
yeah.
But it would lose its force if they had to go like, "Hey Bob, give me a coin," something like that.
One of them had it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They don't all have to, pull one like, hey, but one of them had it. And they're going to bring it to him. It's just very embarrassing, right? But
Yeah.
they thought that they had this question that nobody would be able to answer, and he answers it. And that's not the only time that happens. Shortly after that, or in the same instance, right? They're just like pummeling him with these questions. And I'm sure that we don't have recorded all the questions. We just have some of them. And so one of the other questions is this really complicated question about a man who gets married and he dies and he's got all these brothers. And in the Old Testament, there was this thing called levirate marriage. Do you guys remember what that is?
Yes, sir.
All right, somebody tell me what it is.
It is if somebody marries somebody else and the husband dies, then the brother of that man or male relative, is supposed to marry that woman to, I think, give him descendants, keep his line alive.
Right. If he dies without having children.
Yes.
If he has kids and then he dies, all bets are off. Right? But if he gets married and then dies and doesn't have children, then the closest male relative has to go take that woman as a wife and raise up children for the deceased man so that his line isn't erased from Israel, right? Yeah, you're exactly right. So their question is, this guy has all these brothers and they all get married to this one lady and they all croak. Now who's going to be married to who in the resurrection? Right? Now they're talking about a bodily resurrection. They're thinking about bodies are going to be raised, because to them that's what resurrection meant, and human beings are going to come back from the dead. Jesus talks about bodies coming out of the tombs. And so when we talk about resurrection in the New Testament, we're talking about bodily resurrections, people coming back to life. Like when Lazarus comes out of the tomb, that is a resurrection. So they're asking the question, when these people come back to life, who will be married to this woman? And what is Jesus's response? Do you remember? It's in the same chapter. It's in chapter 22.
He just says you're wrong because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God.
Mm-hmm. Keep going.
For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. As for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God.
Hang on. For people who are following along, it's Matthew chapter 22. He's about to read verse 31 again.
Yes, sir.
And you can just finish that little section there.
Okay. As for the resurrection of the dead, you have not read have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching.
Okay. So Jesus answers their question by referring back to the law, to Exodus, in the passage about the bush. In the first century, there are no chapters and verses yet. They have the scrolls, and you refer to passages by what happened, right? So the passage about the burning bush, which is Exodus 3 for us, and he quotes where the Lord says, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. All right. And so the important thing here is not the tense of the verb, right? You'll hear people come and go, I am, right? Present tense verb. He's still there. That's not the thing. The thing is that Abraham still has the promise, right? Isaac still has the promise. Jacob still has the promise. In fact, I know over in Mark's, I haven't looked through Matthew in a while. The verb is not there in Mark. The being verb is not there. And so the tense of that verb is not the argument. The argument is that God made a promise to Abraham, and that promise still stands. God made a promise to Jacob, to Isaac, and those promises still stand. Those promises are no good if there is no resurrection, right? What's the point of Abraham having promises if Abraham is not going to get the promises? And so God is still their God. He keeps his word. And so for the Sadducees to say there is no resurrection, what they actually have to do is they have to say God doesn't keep his promises. That's the force of Jesus's argument. And so the very nation that God has chosen is founded upon the promises given to Abraham. And if Abraham is dead and gone, then there's no promise, right? And so that really is the force of the words here. And he says when the resurrection happens, they're going to be like angels who don't marry and they're not given in marriage. Now, what does that mean?
They don't marry and they're not getting into marriage.
Right. So there's no marriage relationships in the resurrection, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't males and females. I mean, there might not be. We could all just be the same, right? In the resurrection. I don't know. It doesn't say that there are no males and females. It doesn't say that we won't have a very similar body to the point where you will recognize me and I will. It doesn't say any of those things. And so anybody who comes along and tries to change that, they're reading into the text. But basically what Jesus says is you don't even understand what the resurrection is going to be like. And here you are trying to make these arguments based off of something that you have no understanding about that actually make God into a liar. And so he just shows the utter foolishness of their position. And that's the point, is they have this question that they think is unanswerable, and the brilliance of Jesus, right? He's not a lunatic. He is absolutely brilliant. And he shows how silly their position is. And that's the point of us getting that story, is look at how smart God is compared to us. We have this unanswerable question, and Jesus answers it like it's not a big deal. And what was the response of the crowd?
They were astonished at his teaching.
They're amazed, right? Because it's a brilliant answer. He's clearly not a crazy fool, right? So that leaves you now. He is either sinister, right? Like wicked beyond belief, or he's who he claims to be. Those are the only two options. He's clearly not crazy. He's brilliant. So now he's either an evil genius,
pretending to be a great moral teacher,
which you people do, right? So there are some really brilliant people who are really, really wicked. So he is either that, right, an evil genius, or he's who he claims to be. But there's not really a third option. You can't just say, well, he was just a misguided teacher, because that's not true. He can't be that because of what he claims. He claims to be the way, the truth, and the life, and the only way back to God. Now, if you say that and you're lying, you're a terrible person. you're not just misguided. You are a terrible, awful, sadistic person. And so that's who Jesus would have to be if he's not telling you the truth. Okay, so now let's look at Jesus. Let's look at who he was and what he did. All right. Let's go to, why don't you guys think of some things? Think of some things that Jesus did that would show us who he is. Can you think of some stuff?
Raising people from the dead.
His temptation in the wilderness.
Okay. Let's start with the temptations in the wilderness, because that's earlier textually. You didn't win. Matthew chapter 4.
Yeah, you can get rid of the smug look now.
All right. So Matthew chapter 4. So Jesus is led into the spirit by the wilderness, and he's tempted by the devil, and he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. Really interesting. We can talk more about that later sometime. The tempter comes and says, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. Jesus answers with the scripture, man shall not live by bread alone. Then the devil takes him into the holy city, puts him up on the temple, and says, if you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. For God says that he won't let anything bad happen to you. And Jesus says, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Then the devil takes him and brings him up on a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. Luke tells us all the kingdoms in the world in a moment of time. And he says, if you worship me, I'll give all these things to you. I'm glad I didn't have to go through that. That would be a very hard thing to say no to. And the thing is, that is precisely why Jesus came, isn't it? To be the King of Kings, to rule over the nations.
So even Satan didn't understand he wasn't making an earthly kingdom?
There's a lot of stuff I don't think Satan understood. Right? Because Satan is not omniscient. He is not God. He's not the bad version of God. He is a created being. He's limited in his power, his knowledge, his presence, all that stuff. Just like you can't be everywhere at once. You can't know everything. Right?
Like he says, going to and fro around the earth.
Yeah, he is a finite, limited being. So yeah, I think there's stuff he didn't understand. And here he is tempting Jesus with the thing that Jesus came to do. Right? Jesus came to establish a kingdom. Right? In the dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream that Daniel interprets, where this rock, uncut by human hands, crushes the statue, crushing all the kingdoms of the earth, basically, and then becomes a mountain that covers the face of the earth. Right? Jesus came to do that. And so here is Satan saying, I'll give that to you if you just worship me. And now Jesus knows what is coming. Jesus knows the price of the kingdom. He will go into the garden and ask for the Father, multiple times ask the Father to take the cross away. And here's Satan saying, I can make that happen for you. But he says no. Okay, so we know he's not a pushover.
I have a question.
Yep.
Why would it be wrong for him to turn the bread into the stones into bread?
That's a really good question, and we'll have to answer that another time.
Okay.
So put that one over on the shelf. We'll just get sidetracked, and we'll never answer our question. Seriously, write that down. Do you have something to write down with?
Not currently. I don't think so.
All right. Well, just store it, and we'll come back to it. So there's one thing. Here's Jesus unequivocally trusting the word of God and refusing to violate his covenant faithfulness to the Father. Right? When he pledges, he keeps his pledge. He keeps his word. Here he comes as the Son of God, the faithful servant of the Lord, and he refuses to give service to another, right? To commit idolatry. He is totally and completely faithful to God. That's a positive character quality, right? You want people to be faithful, to be trustworthy. And here Jesus is showing these trustworthy. All right, so what was the other thing you guys said?
I mentioned raising people from the dead.
Okay, yeah, raising people from the dead. Let's just throw all of his miracles in there. All right, so notice that none of his miracles are like blowing people up. Right? Like he doesn't go into Samaria and go, watch this, guys. That's not what he does. But when he goes places, he heals the sick. People who have terrible diseases, that woman who has been sick for 12 years, and she has spent all of her money. She has spent everything that she has on doctors, and Jesus heals her. Okay, crowds of people come to Jesus, and he heals them. He has compassion on them. And listen, that's not even what he came to do. He didn't come to heal the sick, but he does that anyway because he's compassionate. Go ahead.
Nothing. I was gonna say something, but then you said. I was gonna say just because he had mercy on those people, he healed them.
Yeah, you're right. Right? There are people who become doctors simply because they want to help people who are ill. Right? They want to save people. And now we don't have the same. We can do amazing things with medicine today. I mean, it is amazing what we can do, but we don't have. There are still things that we don't have the ability to treat, and there's just nothing we can do. But Jesus could, and Jesus often did. And that's not even why he came, right? There's that Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus and she wants him to heal her daughter. And what does he say to her? The first thing, what does he say?
Is it right to give the children's bread to the dogs?
Yeah, first he says, I've come to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. No, I didn't come to heal your daughter. Right? He's not being mean. It's just that's not why he came, right? He has a job to do. And so then she says, please? And then his response is it right to take the children's bread and feed it to the dogs? What's her answer?
Yes, but even the dogs lick up the crumbs from the children's plate.
Yeah, that's why dogs like little kids. Yeah,
children drop the food on the ground like corn dogs, and
like when we go to Oma's house.
Yes.
Who do the dogs hang around?
Me. I mean, the little kids.
The people they think they'll get food from, right? A dog's loyalty is only as strong as their belly, right? They're going to hang around who they think will feed them. But she's right. She's like, I totally understand what you're saying. I know you didn't come yet. She trusted him. Yeah, that's fine. But since you're here, please. And Jesus said yes. The Gadarene man, the Gerasene demoniac that we talked about earlier, Jesus sailed across over into Gentile territory to heal that man. And then he came right back. Right? And so there's this sense in which you can see Jesus is compassionate on people. And he didn't come to heal the world's ills. He's going to do that, but that's not why he came that first time. Right? There is a day coming when all the curse of sin will be undone. Everything will be gone. There'll be no more death. There'll be no more sickness. Those things will be gone. He is going to do that because he is compassionate. But that's not why he came the first time. He came the first time to make possible the second. Right? So he has to come and die on the cross. And so in doing that, he is showing ultimate compassion, ultimate mercy. And he will even say over in John 15, greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. So he is showing the ultimate love in his willingness to die for other people. Now, I don't know about you, but I have yet to find the evil genius who is sinister and diabolical beyond all comparison, who is willing to sacrifice himself to save other people.
Yeah, there's a book about Jesus called More Than a Carpenter.
By Josh McDowell, yeah.
Yeah, and he mentions that nobody would die for a lie. If it's wrong, like you were lying the entire time, you're just like, I was lying. This isn't real. Just let me go, and I'll be quiet.
If he had said he was lying, the priest would have been okay, cool, and then he would have let him go.
Yeah, they let him go. That's all they wanted.
They tried to get him to say that. Yep.
Now, I don't know what they would have done, but it certainly would have been the end of things, right? I will offer as evidence the small children. Right? When a small child thinks they're about to get in trouble, what do?
Lie.
Or?
Hide.
Or?
Lots of things. Run.
Yes. Right. No, y'all are right. I was just going to keep saying or, because they will do whatever they need to do to get out of trouble. Sometimes lie, sometimes tell the truth, sometimes hide things, sometimes run away, sometimes blame other people. Right? They will do yes, it was him. Right? Big people do the same thing.
Never. Look, I was targeted.
right?
I'm hiding from that.
That's right. We do the same things. We just are more sophisticated in the way that we do it. Right. And so Jesus, as soon as they start getting out the spikes to nail him to the cross, if he's not telling the truth, at that point you go, just kidding. It was a joke. Right. But nobody does that. The apostles, they don't do that either.
And even if he did think it was the truth, most people might be willing to ignore the truth to get out of it.
Well, yeah, if he's lying, maybe he really thinks he's telling the truth, right? But he's not crazy. But maybe, just for sake of argument, he was crazy. But then he's killed when he's not raised after 3 days, because if he's lying, he's not going to be raised from the dead. So after 3 days, if he's lying and you're one of the disciples, you don't go steal the body just so that you can continue the lie and then get killed yourself.
Yeah.
Right? After that, you just kind of cut your losses and say, well, that was a waste of 3 years. Let's go find something else to do. Right? But they don't do that. And so when you just start looking at the evidence and you look at Jesus himself, the best evidence that you should believe in Jesus is Jesus himself. The fact that he is raised from the dead. That is what Christianity hinges on. It's the resurrection.
And nobody's been able to produce the body of Jesus.
Yeah, it's nobody produced it. But you're not going to produce it at this point. Right?
Yeah.
Nobody produced it when it would have been very easy to do so. Nobody can disprove who Jesus is when he's alive. The fact that he is raised from the dead, that he appears to so many people, over 500 people at one time. The fact that other people will see him later in visions. Paul will see him. Paul will have conversations with him. Right? So all these things, when you start looking, it really hinges on that one thing, the resurrection of the dead. The Apostle Paul over in Romans chapter 1, let's turn over there. Let's look over in Romans chapter 1. It's at the very beginning of Romans. This is a really powerful statement that if you're not careful, you just kind of gloss over it. So, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, Romans chapter 1, and we'll finish with this. A servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So everything, right, how we looked in the Old Testament and said, well, just check. See if what he says or what he did is actually what the Old Testament says he's supposed to do. Right? It's promised in the Scriptures concerning his son, who's descended from David, all these things you can test, according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power, according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. So the Holy Spirit declares that Jesus is the Son of God. How?
By his resurrection from the dead.
By raising him from the dead. So Christianity hinges upon that resurrection.
And the fact that the priests couldn't unprove that, or disprove, sorry.
Yeah.
The fact that they couldn't disprove that is, to say the very least, very suspicious. Because how hard would it be if they stole the body? You've got to do something with it now. They've got to hide it somewhere else, and all you've got to do is find it.
Or torture them. Right? I'm serious. Yeah. They do that in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5. There's a reason why throughout history people have used torture to get information, because it works. I mean, seriously, if somebody brought me into a dungeon and used thumb screws on me, I'll tell you anything you want in about 30 seconds. It works.
I think I would tell them before they use the thumb screws.
That's even better. We're going to use these on you. I'll tell you anything. Right? It works. Right? And so they beat them. They punish them. They mistreat them. They lock them in jail. They do all kinds of things to these people. All sorts of things that we don't have recorded for us in the text. Right? The biblical text does not tell you everything that happens. It just tells you some of the things that happen. And the Jewish leaders were mistreating the Christians for that very reason. If we can just get them to tell us that it's a lie, if we can just get them to tell us where the body is, something, but they never do. Right? If it's a lie and I'm in on it and you start torturing me, I'm going to sing like a canary. Right? I have no delusions of grandeur when it comes to my ability to lie in the face of torture. If there is something that is true, I can't tell you that it's not. But if I know it's false and you're hurting me real good, I'm going to do anything to make you stop. Right. And so all of that stuff, when you start looking at all these things, there are lots of good reasons to believe. There are lots of good reasons, especially when we take an honest look historically at what we have. I don't think there is even a case to be made that Jesus is not a real person.
Don't don't even the Jews who don't think he is the Messiah, don't they at least
Yes.
know that he was a real person?
Yes. They just disagree with his claim to be Messiah, right? Which would make him anathema to a Hebrew, right? To the Jewish religion. He would be worthy of death, right?
Because that would be blasphemy.
Yeah, he'd be a blasphemer. He would be cut off from the people of Israel. The fact that he's real, when you look at who he was and what he did, it matches with what the Messiah was supposed to do. When you look at the testimony about him from others and from himself, it shows him to be a good, honest person, and he's resurrected from the dead. I mean, there's not a real good reason not to believe, right? And so that's why we would do.
Another thing that might also kind of show that his resurrection is at least feasible is the fact that he raised Lazarus and nobody, first of all, could prove it was a hoax. And then second of all, that caused such a commotion, the priests actually wanted to assassinate Lazarus.
Yeah. We can't deal with this, so we're going to try and make the problem go away.
So if Lazarus is raised, that certainly makes another resurrection later much more believable.
Well, and when he is raised, right, there are many people, it talks about in Matthew, many people who are also raised from the dead. And so there's not just one resurrection, there's many resurrections.
Isn't that when he dies too? Like whenever he...
No, it's talking about it during his death in Matthew chapter 27, but it talks about when he is raised, the tombs of many saints were opened and they came out and went into the city.
That'd be so cool.
Yeah. So the day that he is raised, not only do you have to deal with the fact that now these disciples are claiming Jesus was raised from the dead, but you're having to go explain why Great Aunt Martha is alive again. Right? So there's a lot to deal with if you're trying to disprove Jesus in the first century. Right? We'll go ahead and leave that there. We're actually past time. It's a little after 8. But if you have any, if you're watching with us and you have any thoughts or comments or things that you'd like to add to the discussion, please feel free to do that. We spent our time this week talking about reasons why you can believe that in Jesus. We've really just scratched the surface of the topic, and so there's a lot more to talk about. Next week, we'll pick up with some other questions. I got some good ones that people have sent me. One of them, which would be very interesting, is talking about the difference between the soul and the spirit. And so we'll have that to look forward to next time. All right. God bless everybody. We love you guys, and we'll see you again soon.